I don't know quite how to say this really, but it seems to me that a lot of us have been raised with a version of Christian faith that basically says that you shouldn't be asking questions. You're supposed to just accept, especially the historical realities, just as they are. And if you raise questions, it may be pulling away some of those fundamental building blocks that hold up the whole structure of your life of faith. That just isn't true. It's good to be asking questions. It's good to be delving deep and looking at some of these difficult problems that are there when we approach the history. And remember that you can hang on to faith. The God of grace is very real. It's just some parts of the story that are a little shaky. It's healthy, to be honest, and to raise questions. And nowhere is there more shakiness and more uncertainty than the ways in which the story was put together, mainly around the 4th century, so 300 years after Jesus, when Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, unified the Roman Empire and declared Christianity to be the state religion of the whole empire. It was at this time that decisions were made by patriarchs, and they definitely were patriarchs of the church, about what should be included and excluded from our Bible. Constantine himself actually took a leading role in this. So it's interesting that we had a Roman emperor who, when we had the story of Jesus, Rome was definitely the enemy, but now we have the Roman emperor actually helping to make the decisions about the religion as it emerged. Constantine was a soldier, first and foremost. He'd been raised in a world of multiple gods, and those were often sort of conflated with each other. The emperor himself was believed to be a god, and Constantine had been part of a small group, an all-male religion of Mithras, which was sort of a bit like a souped-up version of Freemasons, with different levels that you graduated from one to the next. It sort of incorporated sun worship into its ceremonies. And there were rumors that Christianity was actually incorporating elements from all of these other mystery religions into the tradition. And some of them may be true, and a lot of them I don't think are. One thing we can safely say, however, I think it's right, the truism that history is written by the victors. The people who win write the history, and generally the people who won were the men, and the people who lost were the women. So let's just be clear about this quotient right from the start. Men wrote, and women's story was untold. We will never know the whole story of Mary Magdalene. We know about her in snippets from the Gospels. The Gospel of Luke tells us in chapter 8 that Mary was one of a small group of women who were traveling with Jesus and his disciples. And it tells us about her that, quote, 7 demons had been thrown out of her. Before you get any lurid ideas about what these demons are, chances are she may have had a history of epilepsy because nobody knew what epilepsy was back then. Or maybe she had some kind of depression or other mental illness or a physical illness. We don't know what those 7 demons were. The fact that she joined the itinerant preaching group indicates that either the condition hadn't been very serious in the first place, or she had indeed been completely healed from it. She doesn't appear by name again until, in all 4 Gospels, she's there at the cross when Jesus is crucified. And then she's present, very present, on Sunday morning to witness the resurrection. In the Gospel of John, she is the only person there, and she's the first person to hear the news, as well as the first person to see the risen Christ. Peter, of course, doesn't take Mary's word for it when she goes and tells him. Typical man. Didn't believe the woman's word and had to go and check it out for himself. The story is in John chapter 20, and the next chapter, chapter 21, is the one in which Jesus tells Peter that he is the rock on which Jesus will build the church. Wow, We've saved the day for Peter, but the biblical scholars tell us that the language of John 21 is significantly different from the rest of the gospel, written probably at another time and tacked on to save Peter's bacon. You don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to suggest that it was too painful for a patriarchal community for Jesus to have given the last word and the word of commissioning to a woman. So we had to put another ending on the story. Please, by the way, forget Dan Brown and Da Vinci Code. There's no evidence to suggest that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene and had children, but there's plenty to suggest that they were very close, and that perhaps she was closer to Jesus than any of the other disciples. We hear nothing more in the biblical record about Mary Magdalene after the resurrection. And I don't know about you, but for me, the silence is deafening. Part of the reason for this silence is that the editors of the New Testament, back to Constantine, chose to exclude some Gospels and other material that might otherwise have been included. There are lots of them, and there's no way I can tell you about them all in a Sunday morning sermon. But, for example, the Gospel of Mary, discovered in 1896 at Magdalene in Egypt. 10 pages of the text, by the way, are missing, and they are the most important pages, so we don't know the real heart of this Gospel. Mary is the main character, and she is portrayed as having a higher status than all the other disciples. There's also a story of her having a powerful vision in which Jesus spoke to her. Sadly, the contents of the vision are missing. We don't know what the vision was. But Andrew and Peter confront Mary about the vision. Peter says, "Did he then speak secretly with a woman in preference to us, and not openly? Are we to turn back and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us?" Then Mary grieved and said to Peter, "My brother Peter, what do you think? Do you think that I thought this up myself in my heart, or that I'm lying concerning the Savior?" Mary is then defended by Matthew, who says, "But if the Savior made her worthy, who are we to reject her?" Hooray! Surely the Savior knew her very well. For this reason, he loved her more than us. Ooh. Again, we have scriptural record for the disciples arguing like spoiled children. It could be that the writer of the Gospel of Mary believed that Mary Magdalene was actually, a lot of people did believe that she was the writer of the Gospel of John. And some people believe that the beloved disciple mentioned in the Gospel of John repeatedly is Mary Magdalene. I don't know. It's a little iffy, but it might, the beloved disciple isn't given a name, and that may point to the fact that the beloved disciple was in fact a woman. So, the story goes on. There are lots and lots and lots of stories. Hundreds of references. Some believe that she retired to Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. There are a lot of very strong traditions that she left by boat and headed to France. And in fact, there are stories about her stopping off in Malta. And there are churches in Malta today where we can go and celebrate Mary Magdalene. But the traditions in France are huge, and they're in several parts of France, mainly in Provence on the southern coast and in Burgundy up towards Paris. And at various stages of history, she's been used for different purposes in France. By the way, I like these French traditions the best. I suspect there's more truth here, but who really knows? There's a strong tradition that she's buried in the church of La Sainte-Gaume, close to Aix-en-Provence. One of the Crusades was fought against the Catharism, the Cathar movement, focused in southern France, in which many people actually did believe that Mary was the wife of Jesus and that she had a special saintly role. But when you look at the history, it's sort of weird the way that people kept coming up with different ideas about Mary Magdalene. She was clearly very important to them, but there was no consistent history. but she was certainly revered and honored. And as a graduate of Cambridge, Oxford and Cambridge universities both named colleges after her, except they called her Magdalene, which is a little weird. I hesitate to mention this point, but I guess it's still necessary. You do know, don't you, that Mary Magdalene is not the woman caught in adultery in the Bible. If anybody is still remembering that story, it's not the same person. I'm seeing some nodding heads. I'm just hoping everybody has internalized that now, and we have to stop saying this very soon. She is not. There are lots of Marys and there are lots of women in the New Testament, and sometimes they get conflated. She wasn't either the sister of Lazarus. The Mary and Martha story is another Mary. So please make sure you keep your Mary Magdalene clear. There were so many propaganda campaigns against her that continue until today. We need to keep her clear. Another famous story bears mention here. One tradition says that after the death of Jesus, Mary Magdalene was able to secure an audience with the Roman Emperor Tiberius. And apparently when she went in to see him, she had an egg in her hand as a symbol of resurrection. And she shouted out, "Christ is risen!" And apparently the emperor laughed and said that the reality of the resurrection was just about as true as the notion that that egg could turn red. Guess what happened? Immediately, obligingly, the egg immediately turned brilliant red, and everybody was convinced, and she preached and witnessed to the household, and everybody became Christian. I think they're great stories. There are lots of stories, and it's fun to explore them all. But I think it's important to remember that behind these stories is very much a flesh and blood human being who was a remarkable woman of faith, who was a leader of the movement, who was close to Jesus. And as we remind ourselves of how much we don't know about Mary, let's simply affirm that she was a loyal disciple of Jesus Christ, and maybe the leading and the most loyal of all. She is the one who alone encountered Jesus in the garden on that resurrection morning, and Jesus calls her by name, Mary. Jesus instructs her to go and tell what she experienced. She had her own great commission right there in the garden on Sunday morning. So what do we learn from Mary Magdalene? I think a number of things. One is, I learned that it's more important to live faithfully than to worry about how people will judge you or tell your story. Mary Magdalene loved Jesus, was devoted to him and his ways. She appears to have had a more mature version of discipleship than most of her male colleagues. We know, by the way, from Luke chapter 8, that as well as Mary Magdalene, there were two other named women, Joanna and Susanna. It says Joanna, Susanna, and many others, so presumably there were a lot more women who were part of the movement who aren't named. And they're disciples of Jesus, and it's clear from that verse that they also were supporting the movement financially. Hello? So who was behind this movement? We never hear about the men supporting the movement financially, as we read about the disciples of Jesus. So I learned from her about faithful, loving support. I learned too about transformation. I learned that no matter what my history, no matter what I did or you did in your life up until now, healing and change are possible. God has a great future in store for you, and it may look very different from your past, because you can count on the healing power of God's love we know in Jesus Christ. I learned too about having confidence. Whatever the specifics of her later life, I see her as being strong and in charge, and having little patience for either men or women who got in her way with their own petty selfish needs. She was part of a world-changing, history-transforming movement, and nothing could stop it. Nothing would get in her way. She didn't need that great commission on the mountaintop. She had her own personal commissioning from for Jesus to go and tell, and she did it. She had a powerful message, and she didn't hesitate to share it. The fourth reality I learned from Mary Magdalene is that the history of the church has been deeply contaminated and damaged by its refusal to accept women in leadership and to give credit for their significant contributions. The notion that only men could lead is absurd. It was absurd then and it's absurd now. Whether it be in the celibate priesthood of the Catholic Church or in the rigid exclusion of women from ordination for most of our Methodist history, it was wrong, and it was an expression of a deep pathology of the soul. We have made some great strides in recent decades, but we still have a long, long way to go to the day when we can celebrate full inclusion, both in the church and in the community as a whole. I found myself wondering what Mary Magdalene would want to say to us if she were standing here this morning. You may want to come up with your own ideas. What would be on her list? On this Labor Day weekend, I suspect that she would be happy to have heard the children's moment, and she would have words of encouragement for those fast food workers who are on strike and protesting across the nation. They're wanting to raise their wages from minimum wage to a living wage. You know, most of those food service workers are women, and many of them are parents. Many of them are struggling to make ends meet by doing more than one job, as well as caring for their children. The expectations are absurd, and they come from a system that is unbelievably sexist. She might have questions about our recent recession, during which most people suffered seriously and a small group didn't suffer at all. Sales of luxury goods continued to increase in demand all the way through the recession. At the moment, five-star hotels are seeing the most robust growth of any segment of the hotel industry. Penthouses in Manhattan have now topped $100 million, and I'm assuming nobody here knows that. And Gulfstream is celebrating a bumper year. During the last 12 months, they have racked up more than 200 orders for the new globe-spanning G650 private jet, which lists $65 million. You can have one. All you need, well, you need more than the 65 million actually, because that's without any of the luxury stuff that goes inside of the cabin fittings and whatever. And then of course you have to pay a flight crew to permanently staff your plane. But you see what I'm saying? Opulence has become more and more conspicuous during the recession. At the same time, millions of people, mainly women, have been deprived of the fundamentals of life. I think Mary Magdalene would say, you need to look at this and you need to do something about this. So today I invite you to dig deeper into Mary Magdalene. Please go away and read some of those stories. There are all sorts of stuff, you can find it. Be careful, because there's a lot of funny stuff out there, but you can find the stories online and in various books. But she is an extraordinary woman, an extraordinary model of faith and of hope and of confidence and love in Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God for the gift of Mary Magdalene. We're going to sing a song about her. Let's stand and sing from the bulletin, A Woman in a World of Men.